Hello and welcome to day 15 of the Understandable programme. Today we are looking at self-compassion. I'm going to reel off some snippets of information about self-compassion which have actually been revelatory to me even on this day at this time. I'll be honest, I've got some great news for you. Self-compassion is different to building self-esteem. So self-compassion, whilst it may seem like a wishy-washy topic or title of discussion to some people, is actually very important and useful for helping us build towards a positive psychology mindset. In the last 2 days we've talked about fears, facing the fears, acknowledging the fears, releasing the fears, and self-compassion comes in handy here because it's a bit like forgiving ourselves for even having those fears or forgiving ourselves for having negative self-judgment. Here is some information about self-compassion. Self-compassion is extending compassion to oneself, unsurprisingly, in instances of perceived inadequacy. Now, perceived inadequacy, the word perceived is important there, as it is important in the dealing of stress. So a lot of stress comes about from one's perceived inability to cope. It's how we see ourselves. So self-compassion and self-image, not self-importance, we want to move away from self-importance where possible, but self-compassion and self-image are to some extent linked. There are three main components of self-compassion: self-kindness, being nice to yourself; common humanity, which essentially involves acknowledging that all human beings have their faults. I'm a bit of a perfectionist and sometimes struggle to handle that, but all human beings have their quirks, let's say, foibles, and the third strand is mindfulness, so seeing things in a special way, in a way that is detached from the pain, but not in a way that sort of bottles it up. So if we deal with ourselves in a mindful, self-compassionate way, then we can acknowledge certain emotions without dwelling on them and letting it manifest negatively in our physical form. Other things about self-compassion: it's different from self-pity. This is good news, isn't it? Self-pity is like falling into that victim state. It's a state of mind or emotional response of a person believing to be a victim or lacking the confidence and competence to cope with an adverse situation. So self-compassion is like being nice to ourselves, treating ourselves as we would treat a sick friend, looking after ourselves. If one of your loved ones was going through a tough time, chances are you and I would say nice things to them. I am guilty of saying things to myself that is far worse than I would ever say to another person. But when utilising self-compassion and self-forgiveness and self-acceptance, so acceptance and forgiveness are key words that come up with regard to self-compassion. Self-compassion, listen to this, is positively associated with life satisfaction, wisdom, happiness, optimism, curiosity, learning goals, social connectedness, personal responsibility, and emotional resilience. So having the psychological toughness to overcome difficult times and work towards achieving our goals, which we'll be looking at in the final 10 days during the execute segment of this program, becomes more likely when we bring self-compassion into play. So self-compassion also associated with a lower tendency for self-criticism. Yeah, let's move away from self-criticism and towards self-compassion wherever possible. Self-compassion lowers depression, anxiety, rumination, so beating ourselves up and dwelling on things from the past. Thought suppression. What? I didn't know that when I was researching it. But it's great because being compassionate towards ourselves means that actually we allow thoughts that we might have otherwise been sort of denying, and I've been doing that in the past where I'm like denying thinking bad stuff because I'm like, no, life's great, I'm perfect, it's fine. But then suppressing all of that can come out in other ways. In personal life, it may or may not have been through imbibing certain substances. Perfectionism. So self-compassion lowers our levels of perfectionism. When you lower your levels of perfectionism, there's less pressure on you and fear of failure dissipates greatly. Also, disordered eating attitudes. I had 13 ice creams in one day on January the 3rd, 2020. That's merely a few months ago. And it wasn't the only time I had more than 10 in one day that week. So I do have an interesting relationship with food, but when in self-compassionate mode, I'm less likely to nail the cornettos for 24 hours. Self-compassion, to conclude, has different effects than self-esteem, but similar benefits. So those in pursuit of high self-esteem can fall foul of that perfectionism trap, and in chasing self-esteem, the negative side effects of that is that it can include moving towards narcissism. This is high self-esteem focus, distorted self-perceptions, and unstable self-worth. So if we're trying to keep our self-esteem super high all the time, then anything that threatens that can be responded to in a slightly defensive way. I've certainly had that in the past, where I'm trying to be super confident, super perfect, and anything that threatens that, I'm like, you what? How dare you say that about me? When self-compassion is in place and acceptance is there, I'm just more chilled out. And in conclusion, self-forgiveness is an element of self-compassion that involves releasing self-directed negative feelings. Research has found that self-forgiveness promotes greater overall well-being, specifically higher self-esteem and lower neuroticism. So forgive yourself, accept yourself, be grateful, be compassionate. Let's all be kind and think nice things in our brain, and then we're less likely to get stressed, less likely to get sick. And I would like to point out what a lovely view this is. I'm enjoying here, and it's got a little bit darker than when I started the video, and for that I'm grateful. I forgive myself for the fact I didn't do this 1 hour ago or even this afternoon. I accept that you bring joy into my life by engaging with this process, and I love you very much. Kwam rak mak mai kohai prachao kum krong sa tu.